All right, everyone. Welcome to my webinar on the American Revolution from the British point of view. This is my first ever webinar that I've put together for parents. And I'm doing this because all the years of my teaching, I've gotten parents messaging me being like, "Oh, Mr. Campbell, I wish you did something for parents so we could take your class too." So I just decided, we'll do this. It'll be fun. We'll do something for parents. Just a random history topic that I think people be interested in. And if this goes over well, if you guys like this, maybe we'll do it, once, couple times a year, just a fun, something for the adults. So if you have any questions or you want to comment during the presentation, please feel free to just put something in the chat and I will respond if I can. Or you can, I don't know if you have the raise hand function like we do in Homeschool Connections, but there might be a function to raise your hand where I'll actually see a little hand going up and then I can call on you. And if you want to talk into the microphone and we can talk that way. So don't feel like you can't interrupt if you want to interject something or, well, as long as it's relevant, interject something that's relevant. But if you have a question or something, we can stop and address it. And if I don't know the answer, I will try to find it for you and I'll follow up by email or something like that. Planning on this going at least an hour. It may go longer than an hour depending on conversation and things like that. But if everybody just, if there's not a ton of conversation, we'll probably be done in an hour. So if there's any questions, like I said, go ahead, put it in the chat box. But without further ado, we're going to get started here on the American Revolution from the British point of view. Boy, I couldn't have picked a better time to choose this topic. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II just a few weeks ago. Everybody is fascinated with stuff to do with Britain, the British monarchy, our historic relation to Great Britain. And I just feel like I hit the jackpot picking this subject in terms of its relevance. And I first got interested in this when I was in college studying history at Ave Maria. My professor, Dr. Christopher Biting, recommended a book on this subject, on the American Revolution from the British point of view. I can no longer remember the name of the book. I've been trying to think about it, but this was a long time. It was like in 2003. So, but it just got me fascinated thinking like, yeah, what was it like from the other side? What did they think? And this brings up the question of whose history, whose history is history, right? Despite our best attempts at being objective, our history is generally going to be told from a certain point of view, a certain perspective. Now, if we are from the United States, and forgive me, Tolentinos, my Canadian friends, they know that in the United States, we just arrogantly call ourselves Americans as if we're the only ones that live on this continent. But in the United States, our American history is traditionally told in a way that reflects our own story, right? Our own values, our own concerns, our own identity as Americans and of what we think America is and what it should be. But of course, that we were just one side of it, right? How was the perception of the Revolutionary era perceived from the other side, from the point of view of the British? Because if we're telling the story reflecting our values, our concerns, our identity, what did the values and concerns and the identity of the British, how did that influence how they perceived these events? I love this illustration here of the colonial army. It's if I would name this illustration to be stand around, hurry up and wait, just like the military today, right? These guys are just standing here waiting. That's pretty much the military. You're just standing around waiting. So we're going to, as we dig through this, the first parts of the presentation are going to be kind of familiar. We're going to hear about things that we know about as Americans, but then as the war starts, it's going to diverge. And we're going to kind of focus on just Great Britain and how they responded to things. So we really have to start this off with the French and Indian War, which went from 1756 to 1763. This was the immediate precursor to the American Revolution. Now, if you read history books, sometimes this war goes by different names. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. And in America, it's called the French and Indian War. The European Convention was to name wars based on how long they lasted. 30 years war, 7 years war, 100 years war. But in America, we tended to name the war after who we were fighting against. So it's called the French and Indian War because the colonists were fighting the French and the Indians. So this was the first true world war, in the sense of a war that was fought on multiple continents. It was fought in North America, it was fought in the Caribbean, it was fought in Europe, it was fought in India, and it was fought in East Asia between the colonial powers vying for control of these colonial empires. So this is the first real global war. And because of that, it was the biggest and most expensive military mobilization ever up to that time in European history. I mean, this was, from their point of view in the 1750s, this was like the war to end all wars in terms of its scope and how expensive it was. So we all know war is expensive, and that was certainly true in those days as well. Now, I mentioned this war was fought, much of it was fought in North America, in Canada, in what is now parts of England and so on. Now, traditionally, wars in the colonies were waged by colonial militias. That is, the British did not actually send regulars over to the continent. It was just too far and too expensive. So colonial militias would handle the fighting here in the colonies. But because of the scope of this war, because of everything that was at stake, the British regular troops were dispatched to the New World to aid the colonial militias. So this was something very new. The actual dispatching of British regulars, the redcoats in the New World, it had never happened before, not until the French and Indian War. And by the way, I don't have the time to go into how this war started. It's way too complicated. it's like I need like a graph. Let's just take it for granted that this war was happening and not worry about why it was happening. But the important takeaway here is this was a big war, very big, very expensive. Now, Britain did eventually win the war. And as a result, they took Canada, right? That is why our Canadian friends, why most of them today, and not French, because Britain took Canada away from France during the war. But even though Britain won this war, it came at an enormous cost, and I mean literally like a monetary cost. Like, this was so expensive. So as peace returned in 1763, the British started looking at their checkbooks and thinking, oh, we've taken on so much debt. We have taken on so much debt. How are we ever going to pay this off? So Britain immediately started looking for ways to pay off their war debts. Now, because the war was so expensive and because much of it was fought in the colonies, the British Parliament thought that it was fair that the colonies should pay some of the costs of this. Now, from the British perspective, this was extremely reasonable because the colonies had received protection from the British Army, contrary to custom. Remember, the British Army had not ever come over to the New World before to fight like this. But this war was different. Contrary to custom, the British Army came here to protect the colonies from the French and their Indian allies, and the colonies had absolutely no cost to themselves. They got free military protection from the British Empire, contrary to custom. So the British Parliament thought this is only fair that the colonies shoulder the cost of this war, at least the North American parts of it. Now, keep in mind here, we're at a time in history where they still actually had to pay for their stuff. The British weren't just like, oh, we'll just crank out money just turn on the printers and print money. We weren't to that point in history yet. So they actually had to literally come up with real cash to pay for their debts, unlike today, where everything's just fake, right? So the British are like, where are we going to find all this money? and they think, okay, the colonies are going to pay for part of it. So they start trying to collect from the colonies. And this is the first thing we have to understand, is that in American narratives about the Revolution, it is often portrayed as British taxes are usually the first thing that you start with. Like, well, once upon a time, the British started taxing us. Okay, but they didn't start taxing for no reason. They were taxing for a very pressing reason, to pay off the war debts that they incurred defending these very colonies. So this is the rationale for why the taxes started going up after the war. But Britain's early attempts to collect from the colonies were continually frustrated. For one thing, the New England merchants evaded British import duties by smuggling. The New England merchants were notorious smugglers. Now, remember, in the old days, there was very strict rules about trade. You were mandated to trade with the mother country. There was a lot of protectionist legislation in place forbidding New England colonists from trading at a disadvantage to British interests. But they did everything they could to evade those protectionist policies by smuggling into the West Indies, smuggling with other European countries. So smuggling was huge business up along the New England coast. And so they easily evaded the British import duties that they placed on their imports in order to try to collect the tax. And the British did not have the resources or the will to put a stop to colonial smuggling. I mean, what are you going to do? Like, dispatch the entire British Navy to patrol the entire coast of North America to stop smuggling? No, we're not going to do that. So, I mean, everything was subject to smuggling. Rum was the big thing, but also, as you see here in the picture, cattle could be smuggled. That's something you don't see anymore any day. Men canoeing a bunch of cattle around. Oh, the sights we miss out on in the modern world. Eh? The British government issued writs of assistance to add legal teeth to tax collection efforts. Writs of assistance were basically special judicial decrees allowing tax collectors to enlist the services of local law enforcement to try to aid in tax collection. But these were frequently bogged down in court. They were the subject of frequent lawsuits, challenged almost as early as 1760, before the war was even over. So these proved ineffective and of dubious legality. Parliament also tried to collect by a direct tax on many paper items. So newspapers, playing cards, bills of mortgage, magazines, stuff like that. This was the famous Stamp Act of 1765. Many people think the Stamp Act was like a tax on stamps. No, it was actually, it mandated that certain documents had to be bought with a certain paper. So the law said, if you're printing a newspaper, if you're printing a deck of cards, a magazine, a mortgage document, a will, any legal document, it had to be printed on a certain type of paper. That paper had to have a certain stamp on it from the British government. And that paper, of course, was more expensive than normal paper. And so this was supposed to be a way of kind of like directly recouping some money from the colonies. Now, the colonists, as we know, protested the act vigorously, arguing that only colonial legislatures could tax them. The Stamp Act of 1765 represents the first time that the Parliament had tried to tax the colonies directly, like levy a direct tax. Before this, the only tax they collected was like indirectly through imports and exports in the form of tariffs. But this was the first time they just tried to level a straight up tax on the colonies, and colonists protested. Now, the Stamp Act elicited so much protest that the government repealed it in 1766. Now, to Britain's credit, next time you're thinking as an American citizen that you're waxing eloquent about how we, won our freedom from the tyrannical British, right? When's the last time we protested a tax of our federal government and they canceled it? Has that ever happened? I'm not aware of it ever happening, where we all get mad at a tax and we say, this is unjust, and the government backs down and says, oh, you're right, let's just repeal it. Of their own free will. No, that typically doesn't happen here, but that's how the British government responded. They're like, okay, fine, we're going to repeal the tax. But Parliament wanted to affirm its authority in general to tax, even though they said we're going to repeal this particular tax. They wanted to let the colonists know, hey, but if we decide to do something like this in the future, it's going to happen. And so they issued something called the Declaratory Act, which basically was a declaration affirming the principle that the British Parliament had the right to impose direct taxes on its colonies. And this was the question in the 1760s, as you see in the quote from Sir Francis Bernard, the governor of New Jersey and Massachusetts. He said, "The question is whether America shall or shall not be subject to the legislation of Great Britain." That's the real question, is the American colonies, are they going to be subject to British legislation or not? So Parliament let a year go by, and then they tried again, this time with indirect taxes. Instead of directly taxing paper, they tried to put today what we would consider sales taxes on various items, like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And these are called the Townshend Acts. Now, part of the Townshend Acts was that all of these were required to be imported from Britain to undercut smuggling. Again, the New England merchant class were huge into smuggling. And so this was the way that Britain tried to undercut that, was by requiring the colonists to import these goods only from Great Britain. Now, this too elicited intense protests. This was actually what they were protesting about when the Boston Massacre happened, right? Remember when the mob in Boston attacked the British regulars and they fired into the crowd, killing a few protesters? That was elicited by protests against the Townshend Acts. So you can see that the British are kind of trying all these different methods to collect tax from the colonies, and they're trying to do it in a way that isn't going to be objectionable from the colonists themselves. Now, from the colonial perspective, this really was a question of representation. We have this famous saying in America, no taxation without representation. This comes from James Otis, a Massachusetts assemblyman, who said, taxation without representation is tyranny. Now, what this meant is, hey, we colonists, we do not vote for parliament. We have no parliamentarian that represents us, you know. Of course, here in the States, we vote for the House of Representatives, right? I'm sure in Canada, you have your members of parliament that you vote for. But the colonists did not have that in those days. We had no representative in parliament. So the theory was, you can't tax us if we don't have representation in government, because then we have no say in what our tax dollars are going for. Now, Americans very frequently take this as kind of like an absolute argument, like there's no rebuttal to it. But the British had two very good rebuttals to the theory of no taxation without representation. And the first was the theory of virtual representation. The British responded and said, hey, look, it doesn't matter that you don't have a specific parliamentarian representing your district, because the members of parliament and the crown speak for the interests of all the British subjects. We are tasked with governing and voting on behalf of the people of the entire British Empire, not just for the interests of your little district or your little state. We still represent your interests. We still represent the colonies, even if you don't specifically vote for a member of parliament, right? So we're saying that the members of parliament, even if they're elected by specific districts, they are not considered representatives of those districts. They act and they speak on behalf of the whole British Empire. So that means that a colonist still has representation, but in a virtual way, not a direct way. So the British said, what are you talking about? You do have representation. It's just of a virtual nature. It's not relevant whether you personally voted for your representative or not. Any member of parliament represents all the subjects of the British Empire. But secondly, we have to keep in mind the limited franchise. Another rebuttal of the British was this. They said, well, look, in 1770, the voting class in Britain was limited to only 14% of the adult male population. 14%. Now, read that again. It's not 14% of the population, but 14% of the adult male population. So this is really like less than 5% of the whole population, or about 336,000 out of 6.4 million. So at the time that the colonies were complaining about taxation without representation, less than 5% of people in Great Britain itself were allowed to vote. So Parliament said, look, even over here in Britain, less than 5% of our people get to vote. What makes you so special that you get to vote? If in our own homeland, the actual Brits, born right here in Suffolk, if only 5% of them get to vote, why should you colonists demand that you all get to vote, right? I don't know how we would take that argument today. It's basically they're shrugging, saying, well, nobody gets to vote. Only 5% get to vote. Why should you get to vote? But that's it's a good point, though. Given that system, they're kind of saying, like, what makes you so special? Everybody okay? Can you hear me all right? Keeping up with everything? Awesome. I hope you're taking notes for the quiz. Oh no, you're not. You're not children. Only the children have to have quizzes. So these protests continued through the 1760s, and there was a question on what is the right approach to take with the colonies. Should the government be hardline or should the government be conciliatory? Like, should we be like, no, you're gonna pay your darn taxes no matter what you say, or should they work with the colonies and kind of try to be conciliatory? How much responsiveness should Parliament show to colonial demands? This is always a tricky question when you have popular protest, right? Like, how conciliatory should you be? If you're too conciliatory, you're going to look weak and you're going to weaken your own authority. But if you're not conciliatory enough, you might cause the situation to become worse. So that was the big question of the 1760s. And how much money should they expect from the colonies? What is the best way to get this money? All hotly debated in Parliament. Now, this chap here, this is Lord North, Frederick North, appointed by King George III in 1770 to be the prime minister. North would serve until 1782, almost the entire duration of the colonial crisis. Now, the way things worked in these days, the prime minister was kind of like the chief of the legislative branch. He mediated between the king and the parliament. He was appointed by the king. The king could appoint who he wanted, but they had to be vetted by the majority party in Parliament. And Parliament already had parties. They had Whigs, they had Tories. So the prime minister had to be vetted and confirmed by the majority party. So North is appointed by the king because he represents the king's ideals, right? And he's going to serve as prime minister throughout almost the whole duration of the colonial crisis till 1782. And like George III, Lord North was a hardliner who wanted to chastise the colonies. So this is what he and the king had in common. So it was the policies of this man in particular with King George that would determine Britain's approach to the revolution. And his philosophy can be summarized by this quote. And I don't know how Lord North sounds, but based on this picture, I think he sounded like this. We must withstand every attempt to weaken or impair royal sovereign authority. I think he was one of those sorts of British guys. I didn't think I'd do accents in the adult class also. I guess I'm just as unhinged in an adult class as in a youth class.
Colonists refusing to pay tax.
All right. Well, Lord North. Lord North knew that in order to really break the colonial resistance, he absolutely needed to undermine the influence of the Boston smugglers. I mean, this was really, as long as the Boston smugglers were still able to carry on their operations unhindered, Britain was going to have a very tough time financially getting control of the colonies. And so he started with tea. Since they did so much traffic in tea, Lord North mandated that the colonies must buy cheap British tea. They could not buy tea any longer from the West Indies or anywhere else. It had to be bought from Britain. And the British tea was so cheap that the smugglers could not compete with it. This was tea from the British East India Company, very, very cheap. So they were undercutting the smugglers. They're basically flooding the market with cheap goods in order to hurt the smuggler class. Now, this leads to the Boston Tea Party. This is why there was such an angry reaction against British tea. Now, this is a huge myth that people, for some reason, latch onto this. They think that we were protesting against taxes on tea, that the reason the Boston Tea Party happened was because the British were taxing the tea and that it was too expensive. The opposite is true. They were destroying the tea because it was cheap junk, right? This is kind of like more like the equivalent of like a union protest against scabs, right? When the union goes out and they're protesting scab workers, it's because the scabs are working for cheaper, right? And undercutting the union wages. So this was the same concept. The Boston Tea Party was because Britain was mandating the use of cheap tea that the smugglers could not compete with. And so they reacted with violence. Of course, we know what happened at the Boston Tea Party. But we're more interested here in the British reaction to the Boston Tea Party. And the British public reacted with utter indignation. People of all classes were united solidly behind the crown in condemning the actions of these colonial rabble-rousers. Now, in the colonies at this time, people were starting to talk of violence. You had the Sons of Liberty talking about, basically terrorist actions against the symbols of British authority. You had tarring and feathering. You had the homes of loyalists sometimes being burned, people being run out of town, loyalist property being destroyed, as in the Boston Tea Party. In Britain, they were much more like thinking of this as a diplomatic problem that could be solved through the political process. They were more like, oh, we're in a hard place, chaps, but there's nothing that reasonable men can't talk over. Really thinking this was something that they could just kind of hammer out through the political process. So when the Americans resorted to violence here, even though no people were harmed, it was a huge destruction of a lot of money worth of tea. The British public was horrified. They thought of us as rabble-rousers, barbarians. I don't know, maybe the way they still think of us, I don't know. So there was a groundswell of support, is what I'm saying, a groundswell of support in Britain for Lord North to continue his crackdown with further repressive measures. So at this moment in 1775, 1774? I can't remember the exact year of the Tea Party, but this solidified British sentiment solidly behind Lord North, and he felt like he had the support of the entire nation behind him. So much so that in 1775, when the colonial representatives sent the olive branch petition to Britain in order to try to smooth over difficulties, Lord North refused to even read it. The olive branch petition was like a petition of colonial claims, and it was an attempt by the colonies to step back from the brink of violence, so I called olive branch. Like, we're going to step back from the brink of violence so that we can try to make peace and smooth out our differences. Lord North refused to even read it because he felt like the British Parliament's hand was that strong in 1775. And so, of course, the refusal to consider these petitions just ensured that the colonists would continue to resort to direct action and violence. Now, of course, I don't know how well my Canadian friends know this, but if you are from the United States, you know that violence began in April of 1775 when shooting began at the battles of Lexington and Concord. Now, as was the case with the Tea Party, the British public was absolutely appalled at this violence, for which they held the colonists entirely responsible. They felt like the British had been perfectly reasonable and that the colonists were entirely at fault. They viewed the American resort to violence as barbaric and despicable. So there was a universal condemnation of violence. But the question on what should be done going forward was very different, and the British public was divided. And I think it's very interesting how they were perceiving this. So on the one hand, you have the doves who don't want war. Now, the doves said, Great Britain has scarcely begun to recover from the costs of the French and Indian War. To go to war with America would be ruinously expensive, disastrous to the British economy. Britain should cut its losses by granting colonial demands, even independence. I think this is astonishing because the Americans themselves had not yet called for independence. In the beginning, the violence at Lexington Concord, the early days of the war, was just to defend our sovereignty, that is our right to self-government, but it wasn't to break away from Britain entirely. That wasn't going to be discussed until later, and it wasn't going to be voted on until the following year. But you have doves in Britain already saying, hey, we would rather cut America loose entirely than go to war again. We've barely recovered from the first one that we just were in. Why would we go to war again? So I think it's interesting that some of the earliest calls for independence are coming from people in Great Britain who are saying independence is preferable to violence. That's how opposed they were to war. And then on the other hand, of course, you have the hawks who are taking this approach.
The potential loss of America would eviscerate the British Empire. The loss of America must be prevented at all costs. Military action is necessary to preserve the country.
So the Hawks saw America as like an integral part of the British Empire, and we could not just allow the British Empire to be eviscerated. And so therefore, it must be prevented at all costs for the sake of preserving the integrity of the empire. But the point is, both sides condemned the violence. Both the Doves and the Hawks thought the outbreak of violence was regrettable, and they condemned it. The Doves simply said, thanks, Honk. The Doves simply said, we are so opposed to violence that we would rather do anything to avoid it. Whereas the Hawks said, we're opposed to violence, but if we need to do it to preserve the empire, so be it. So we can see from the beginning, the war never had unanimous support. From the very outset, from April of 1775, there was a strong segment of British society that favored independence for the colonies. Right from the beginning, there was support in Britain for American independence. Now, what is very interesting about the battles of Lexington Concord is what the different sides chose to focus on. If you're American, you know that we chose to focus on, well, the Brits came to take our guns, they came to take our powder, and we stood up to them at Lexington and Concord and made a stand for our rights to self-defense and et cetera, which is true. But the British focused on the barbarism of Americans at these two battles. So after the Battle of Lexington, you had this situation where there was a wounded British soldier who was laying there crawling around on Lexington Green, and a young Minuteman came up to him and killed him by whacking him in the head with a hatchet over and over again. Actually, come to think of it, I don't even know if the guy actually died. I think the Minuteman might have been such a noob that he couldn't even successfully kill a guy by hitting him in the head with a hatchet. I feel like I remember reading the guy survived, but I don't remember. Perhaps he died. I mean, I don't know. But you had this Minuteman who came up and was whacking a British soldier in the head with a hatchet. And though this was only one act in a very large campaign, historians have noticed that the British who wrote letters home, the British soldiers writing letters home after Lexington Concord, almost 30% of them mentioned this event in their letters. It was like this was something that deeply troubled the British soldiers and the British public, that almost a third of the soldiers wrote home mentioned this episode. And this was widely circulated in British media as evidence of American barbarity, right? That the Americans were barbarous. They'd become degenerate from living among the natives, and they no longer possessed British manners or British sensibilities. So this was taken as evidence of American barbarity. Of course, when there's a war going on, there's always going to be atrocity stories, right? Like, oh, the enemy, they murder prisoners and they kill children and they burn dogs, and and so you always have to take this stuff with a grain of salt. But this was publicized around. But the Continental Congress, meanwhile, suppressed reporting on this event. They issued directives forbidding soldiers or officials from writing about it, and they actually censored their letters if they did. So the censoring of letters during wartime began a long time ago. Colonial soldiers who mentioned this episode in their letters home had their letters censored because the Americans realized that this was damaging to the reputation of the Continental Army. By the way, a fun side story, this guy, this young teenager who whacked this British soldier in the head with the tomahawk, he survived into old age. He was still alive in the 1820s. And there's a record of him talking to a minister saying that he was afraid he was going to be damned to hell because of what he did. And the minister's trying to console him and be like, oh, if you're sorry, I'm sure it's going to be okay. But even that late in life, 50 years later, this guy was troubled by it. He was like, oh gosh, I whacked this guy's skull with a tomahawk when I was a kid, and am I going to hell now? So as the war unfolded, attitudes by class kind of crystallized. So the king and the parliament are the elites, right? They are the creme de la creme of British society. So their attitude was that from 1775 on, their resolve to prosecute the war was hardened. They were basically, gung-ho, all guns blazing into this effort. There was a minority that opposed them, but the majority at this time, the parliamentary majority, favored the king and favored the war. Now, the merchant class, this is like the middle class. The merchant class were not so gung-ho because they were going to be hurt by the war. It's obviously going to disrupt trade. And so they sent a letter to the king and parliament in 1775, very respectful, saying if we're patriotic Brits, we understand the parliament's position, but we are begging you to find some other way to solve this other than war. So they sent a collective letter to Parliament saying, quote, save us from a lasting and ruinous civil war. They could see their business just drying up as war broke out. And so they were begging the Parliament and the king, please find some other way. Now, when we go down to the working class, you have sympathy with American ideals, though not necessarily with the means. Like I said, everybody was opposed to the violence. They didn't believe that revolution was justified, but they sympathized with American ideals. They sympathized with no taxation without representation because, like I said, only 5% of British people could vote. So these people sympathized with American ideology, I guess, with the writings of Thomas Paine or the ideals of Jefferson, Franklin, these people. And it actually facilitated discussion about reforming Britain's political system. So you got these working class chaps talking in these pubs in in Manchester or wherever, and they are voicing sympathy with the attitudes of the revolutionaries. Of course, the ironic thing is the revolutionaries are not working class people. The American Revolution was not a revolution by the working class against the elites. It was a revolution of American elites against British oversight. All our founding fathers were elites, right? They were the wealthy merchant class and the landowning class. So these class distinctions here gave the impression that it was the elites who wanted the war in Britain. I mean, if you look at it, basically the poorer you get, the more opposed to the war you were. So this contributed to the impression that this was a rich man's war, that this was a war perpetrated by the elites. Which is, I think that's a criticism that exists in any war, right? It's not poor people who start wars usually. Charles Townshend, exchequer in charge of collecting import duties on British trade, remarked, "The government and parliamentary majority have drawn us into a war unjust and ruinous." Townshend is the one that the Townshend Acts are named after. But you can see this attitude here, this class attitude, that it's not, it's not firmly united. It's not like this is Britain's war. He's saying this is the government's war and Parliament's war. It's unjust and it's ruinous. And I should say unjust because it's ruinous. Okay, so from 1775 to 1777, the majority of people in the government, at least, are behind the war. It's kind of like reminiscent of that time after 9/11 when there was a majority of Americans that were united behind President Bush. But then things changed, right? Things changed here in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga. The British were soundly defeated and the French entered the war on America's side. Now, this is only the second year of the war, all right? Remember, the American Revolution went on for 8 years, and this is only year 2. After this defeat, Lord North tried to end the war. Isn't that something? Lord North, who was a hardliner, he wanted to punish the colonies. Right here, 1777, we're not even 2 years into the war. Actually, I think it's more like a year and a half. He's like, we need to be done. Because he realized right away that fighting France and the American rebels simultaneously would be unsustainable. So Lord North is ready to throw the cards down right then. This war could have ended in 1777. But George III insisted on continuing. Now, the prime minister in this system, the prime minister has to push for the king's policies, right? Similar to like an attorney general has to prosecute the legal affairs of the state. The prime minister is supposed to prosecute the king's policies. When Lord North saw that the king was opposed to him, he tendered his resignation, but the king forbid him from resigning. Why would the king forbid a prime minister from resigning if he knew that that prime minister opposed his policy? Anybody want to take a guess on this? Why would the king not allow Lord North to resign? Crickets. You have until I take my sip of water. Because he would look weak. No, it's not about optics. It's actually about the system of how they get a prime minister. And even though Lord North was now opposing the king thought that the next prime minister would be even worse. And here's why. Because remember, a new prime minister would have to be vetted by the opposition, right? Prime minister is appointed by the king, but they have to be vetted and approved, kind of like a Supreme Court nominee in the United States. So the opposition to King George in the war was getting increasingly strong after the Battle of Saratoga. So the king knew that if he tried to appoint a new prime minister, in order to get the votes to approve him, that he was going to have to make concessions to America. Basically, the opposition was going to say, we will only vote for your nominee if you agree to X, Y, and Z concessions. And King George did not want that. He wanted to keep all the cards in his hand regarding America. And so Lord North was kept in office because the king knew that that he would have to make concessions if he tried to appoint someone new. So despite being in opposition to the king's policies, Lord North stayed in office for the next 7 years of the war. Now, Amanda, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
So is the prime minister voted on today in England, or is it still appointed by the monarchy?
No. The way a prime minister in England takes office today is, in England, in a parliamentary system, they vote for parties. They don't, like, people don't campaign for prime minister the way we campaign for president. So parties campaign and the parties choose a leader. And what happens in England, in Britain, is whatever party wins the election, the leader of that party de facto becomes the prime minister, just by virtue of being head of the party. Now, they maintain a tradition harkening back to these old days where after the party wins, the monarch has to invite the leader of the party he invites him to form a government. So the king will today, King Charles will invite whoever wins that election, the leader of the party, and say, I invite you to form a government. This is a callback to the time when the king actually appointed the prime minister. Is that how it works in Canada, Tolentinos? Yeah. So when we have a prime minister like, whoever, I can't remember the new prime minister, but Boris Johnson or whoever, it's not like he's out there campaigning. He just becomes prime minister by virtue of being the head of the party. Okay, but back in the day, though, the king appointed the prime minister directly with parliamentary approval. So Lord North is kept in office. Now, here's a question, though. So now you've got the prime minister for the next 7 years going to be in power, or 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it is. I'm a historian, not a mathematician. How zealously do you think he's going to prosecute the war now, right? He is morally convinced the war should be over. Do you think he's going to commit all his resources to the war? Do you think he's going to be gung-ho? Do you think he's going to prosecute the war with his whole heart at this point? No. From 1777 on, the war is going to be fought just kind of half-hearted because the prime minister himself doesn't believe in it anymore. So he's going to try to mitigate loss, right? He's going from a position of guns blazing, we're going to win this thing, to, okay, I don't believe in this anymore, so how can I manage it in such a way to keep the losses at a minimum, right? Very timid. So the king is frustrated that he can't get as much support as he wanted anymore. So in 1778, the king gets Parliament to pass the Papist ACT. The Papist Act, which encouraged Catholics to enlist in the army to support the war effort. Now, traditionally, Catholics were not allowed to keep arms in Great Britain because they were a despised religious minority subject to persecution since Elizabethan times. They certainly weren't allowed to join the army and get trained in military discipline, right? But that changed in 1778 when Parliament passed the Papist Act, allowing Catholics to enlist in the military and encouraging them to. Lana, sacrifice the Catholics. Yeah, we can't get any honest Protestant proddy Brits to go over to America anymore. So we're going to just throw the Irish over there and throw the other Catholics over there. Now, this was extremely unpopular. It led to an outburst of anti-Catholic violence in 1780 called the Gordon Riots. So basically, the reason behind the Gordon Riots was anti-Catholic hostility, the idea that, look, you are arming a Catholic segment of the population who are, they could possibly rebel against us, right? It was very unpopular. Catholics were very, they were questioned. Their loyalty in Great Britain was questionable at the time. That's the way regular Brits viewed it. So it's basically like it'd be like if after 9/11, imagine if right after 9/11, if the government was like, we're forming a Muslim brigade in the American army. We want to encourage all Muslims to join the American army. We'll train you. We'll give you weapons and firearms and teach you how to blow stuff up, right? Whether or not American Muslims were actually dangerous at the time is not the point. The point was the optics of this. The optics would have been very bad had the government done that, and the optics were very bad here in the Papist Act. So this led to the Gordon riots. 60,000 protesters marched on Parliament chanting "No Popery." Several government buildings were attacked. The military had to be called out to quell the riots, which lasted a week, and 285 people were killed in the riots. The military was trying to put down this mob that had actually attacked Parliament buildings and set fire to government buildings over opposition to Catholics serving in the British Army. So you actually, I mean, this is pretty astonishing. It's astonishing to think about Catholic, in an English-speaking country, that Catholics simply joining the armed forces caused so much consternation, and that this was, need to be put down. But it's amazing thinking about how, opposed to violence the British were, how, like at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, I think it's been a while since I read this, but I think something like 19 people were killed at Lexington, like very few casualties, and they were horrified by the violence. And then it's like here in London itself, they've got a riot where 285 people were killed protesting this law. So this definitely aroused the passions of the British people. So by 1780, this was the year that the British public began to totally give up on the war. There was this growing sentiment that the war was simply unwinnable. And James Boswell, who is a famous biographer and lawyer, said, "Those who could understand were against the American war, as almost every man is now." So Boswell in 1780 says that anyone who understands the situation is against the war. If you're in the know of what's going on, you're opposed to this thing. Growing sentiment that it was simply unwinnable, and coupled with increasing calls for domestic reform of the British political system at home. In other words, like I said, these American ideas percolating, like, yeah, why don't we have a greater franchise? Why? How come I don't got representation? Right? So calls for political reform of. So by 1780, if we were to take a poll, if we were go into Westminster and take a poll of all the ministers of state, we would find that all the ministers except for one thought the war was lost, and they were looking for a way to cut their losses and end it. Every single minister except for one. I can't remember which one it was, though. I couldn't find it. I forgot. So, oh well. Just take my word on it. It's near unanimous. Isn't that crazy, though? The war went on for 3 more years. You have a place where there's almost unanimity in the highest level of government that the war is unwinnable and that should be ended, but it goes on for 3 more years. This is because George III himself continued to insist that the war was winnable. I think George had a sense that no one else was committing the way he wanted. Like, perhaps if the British state was all in, like if they were fighting this the way they fought the French and Indian War, or if they fought this the way that we fought World War II, maybe things could have been different. But George could sense that everywhere people were kind of like giving lip service to what he wanted, but in practice trying to mitigate risk as much as possible. And one thing you cannot do, you cannot win a war by risk mitigation. War inherently necessitates committing yourself to substantial risk. By the way, if you've ever seen this meme, this is a popular meme. This is James Boswell, the guy I just read the quote from, who said every thinking man knows is opposed to the war. That's this fella. If you've ever seen this meme, it is one of my favorite historical memes. All right, so So this is really astonishing because I think in the United States, we tend to imagine that the British government was kind of unanimously opposed to American independence. We tend to think that the British were just like,
oh, who do these peasants think they are? We need to put them in their place.
Really wasn't true. America had supporters in the highest level of parliament. In fact, supporters of America flagrantly opposed royal policy. There was a Whig politician, Charles James Fox, who was probably the most powerful opponent of the king in parliament. His followers all wore the buff and blue. That's the colors of Washington's army. To parliament, two parliamentary sessions as a sign of support for the colonial struggle. I mean, look at that. This is a British parliamentarian in the midst of a rebellion wearing the colors of Washington's army to parliament, literally wearing the colors of men who are taking up arms against the king as a sign of support for the colonial struggle. Could you imagine that happen now? Could you imagine we're in the war in Afghanistan and, people are coming to Congress wearing, ISIS banners or something? It'd be insane. But it just shows you the degree to which there was support for this cause. Now, notice by 1780, the opposition had gone from merely opposing the war to actively supporting the cause of the rebellion. They are actively supporting Washington's army, wearing the buff and blue to sessions of parliament. So they'd gone from opposing the war to supporting it. And what's interesting is that this was allowable within the British system. Were these people arrested for treason? No, they weren't. This was considered a legitimate exercise of political free speech. So Charles Fox, who, like I said, was the preeminent opponent of the war and the most powerful member of the opposition, and one of the most eloquent speakers representing the minority party, which were the Whigs, he's going to make a motion in Parliament to end the war. By the way, Charles Fox is also a notable anti-slaver who campaigned relentlessly for the abolition of the slave trade. He also occasionally wrote letters to Thomas Jefferson. He'd met Benjamin Franklin in Paris, and he had predicted that Britain had little hope of subduing the colonies. And he actually approved of the colonial struggle. He said, this is a struggle for liberty against the oppressive policies of a despotic, unaccountable executive. Now, I don't think George III was despotic by any means, but the point is that Charles Fox, the leader of the parliamentary minority, was adopting the ideology and language and rhetoric of the colonial rebels. And so he introduced a motion in summer of 1781 to end the war in America. This was supported by one of the up-and-coming young parliamentarians, William Pitt the Younger, who is one of the most famous politicians in British history. He made a rousing speech in favor of Fox's motion. I'm going to do another accent here. What kind of British accent does Pitt the Younger probably have? I don't know. He probably sounds very refined. This guy looks very intellectual. Let's see. He said, I am persuaded, and I will affirm, that it is a most accursed, wicked, barbarous, cruel, unnatural, unjust, and most diabolical war. The expense of it has been enormous. And yet what has the British nation received in return? Nothing but a series of ineffective victories or severe defeats. That last sentence is very key, summing up the British experience in the Revolutionary War: ineffective victories or severe defeats. Pitt's speech was praised by both sides. William Pitt, by the way, would go on to become prime minister in 1804, one of the most famous prime ministers in British history. How famous was he? He has a look at this monument to him. This is in Guildhall in London. Gosh, we don't do this for American politicians. Can you imagine Speaker of the House getting a monument like this like, like, uh, okay, John Boehner, we're gonna build you a big monument like this in Philadelphia. I don't think Americans would like. I wouldn't like that. We don't have a worthy Speaker of the House to deserve a monument at all. But anyhow, that's how famous Pitt was. He has a big monument to him in Guildhall in London. Beautiful imagery here too. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked by the picture. This is Pitt the Younger. This image here represents the British Empire. Okay, you see this horse? You see it's a horse turning into a sea monster, right? So the horse represents Britain's military might, and the sea monster represents its naval power. And you can see it sitting on the seas. So, and this woman is a personification of Britannia, right? This is the British Empire. And this, these two figures, I can't remember what this is. This is holding the staff of Asclepius. This probably signifies the health of the state. I don't know what this is. I can't see the iconography of it, or symbolism. But the gist of this is that William Pitt, by his statesmanship, is securing the health of the British Empire by successfully navigating Britain's diplomacy on land and sea. He's governing the ship of state successfully. So cool statue. Anyhow, the motion to end the war was defeated because the king still had the majority. And so the war dragged on another 2 years. Now, Pitt had said that Britain won nothing from this war. All we got is ineffectual victories and severe defeats. And indeed, it would take a very severe defeat of great magnitude in order to persuade King George to call off his efforts in America. Parliament did not know it, but even as they debated, a campaign was unfolding in Virginia that would deliver Pitt's severe defeat. Look at the chronology here. This was in, when was this motion? Summer of 1781. Now, if you know your history, you know that in October of 1781 was the Battle of Yorktown, just a few months after the speech in Parliament. So in October of 1781, the British General Cornwallis found himself surrounded on Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia, with the Americans blocking off retreat from the peninsula and the French blockading him by sea. He surrendered his entire army to General Washington. An entire British army of 10,000 soldiers and German mercenaries became American prisoners of war. And as Cornwallis surrendered, the British military played the song, "The World Turned Upside Down," which must have been how it seemed to them. So this is a massive, massive defeat, not just a defeat, but an entire army surrendered into American hands. Now, news of the defeat reached Britain by the following month. When he heard it, Lord North exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over now." And Lord North and his supporters were relentlessly lambasted in the British media. You can see this picture here. Lord North and his supporters are depicted as incompetent tinkerers ruining the state kettle. These old school political cartoons are hilarious. They had a whole like symbolism of state that is foreign to us now. Like, if I didn't tell you what this was and you saw this picture, you probably, what the heck is this? It's a bunch of guys banging on a kettle. But the resources of the British state were conceived of as being in a giant kettle, like a giant bronze pot. And tinkerers are like the people who make, metallurgists who make these goods. And so they are conceived of as ruining the kettle of state, breaking it, cracking it, in other words, losing all of the state's resources. And you can see Lord North on his knees at the bottom right, chiseling away, ruining the state kettle. Even though Lord North himself by this time was not in favor of the war, but it was his job to support the war. All right, so North immediately upon hearing of Yorktown, he's like, this is out of control. He proposes a conciliation plan offering to eliminate every disagreeable act in the colonies if they would just end the war. So he says to the colonies, look, we will agree to all your terms if you just stop fighting and, whatever you want. We'll agree to all your terms. I mean, short of independence. He's saying if you agree to remain colonies, we will agree to whatever you say. But the colonies refused because now they knew that the British were ready to talk. On February 27th, 1782, the House of Commons passed a motion of no confidence in the ministry of Lord North, and he resigned in March, forced out of office. Now, not being from a parliamentary country, I'm not sure I understand exactly what a motion of no confidence means, but today, as I understand it, no confidence basically dissolves the government. They have to call for new parliamentary elections. I'm not sure what it meant in 1782, but what it meant essentially, practically speaking, was that Lord North was politically neutered. He could not do anything else. And so he resigned despite the wishes of George III to avoid this. By the way, the Continental Congress actually minted a coin celebrating the ousting of Lord North from power. This is a coin, commemorative coin, celebrating the fall of Lord North. British legislators vote against continuing the war. Lord North resigns, despite the wishes of George III. I don't know what this is. This is a picture of Lord North being like, I resign. I don't know, but so we got a commemorative coin here. Okay, so after 12 years in power, Lord North is out, and we get the Marquis of Rockingham. Now, so you got a vote of no confidence in Lord North's government. There's new elections, and now the Whigs are in the majority. So now the minority has become the majority. This is equivalent in the United States to when, the House changes hands, right? Lord North was replaced as prime minister by the Marquis of Rockingham. And Rockingham had always been a supporter of the colonies. And look at this, even as early as 1771, he was supporting giving them a constitution. That's wild. The Americans themselves hadn't even, when our Constitution, it's ratified in 1787, we hadn't even decided we needed a constitution yet. And Lord Rockingham was saying you should have one back in 1771, 4 years before the war started. And also representation. This just goes to show you that many of the British, even in government, even among the elites, were very forward-looking when it came to the United States and the colonies and their place in the British Empire. So once in charge, Rockingham immediately pushed Parliament to recognize the independence of the United States. So now you've got the whole legislative branch of the British government saying we support independence. And so this finally compelled King George to start the Treaty of Paris to end the war by recognizing independence of the United States. Now, unfortunately, Rockingham died of flu in July, having spent 4 months in office. It's just a reminder that people do actually die of the flu, right? So 4 months in office, he's dead, but we've got the machinery rolling to end the war. So King George now has to deal with the Whigs, right? Because his party is out of power. He's got the Whigs in power, so he's basically got to deal with he can pick a prime minister, but the Whigs are, it needs to be someone from their side if he wants to get them approved. And so he asks Lord Shelburne to become prime minister. Now, Shelburne said, yes, I'll be prime minister, but only on the condition that you recognize the independence of the United States of America. And King George agreed. So by now, the summer of 1782, King and Parliament both now agree to end the war and recognize the United States. So notice this, that the push to recognize American independence is coming solidly from Parliament, right? How different from 1775 when Parliament was taking the hardline approach, saying like, we need to tax them, we need to show them who's boss. But now by 1782, the push to recognize independence is coming from Parliament. And they essentially push the king's hand to end the war and recognize the independence of the United States. Now, in the beginning, France and the United States tried to negotiate together. France and the United States had this agreement where the French said, okay, we're going to negotiate the end of the war together. So we both stand strong against the British. We both get the best deal possible, right? We've had these sorts of arrangements before, right? Remember in World War II, we had agreed that we would not seek, that the Allies would not seek separate pieces with Germany and Japan. Basically, we stand together. France and America had a similar agreement, but Shelburne was such a good diplomat. Shelburne went to the United States. He's like, why don't we negotiate a separate peace? You don't really need us and the French. We have our own problems, go way back. You don't need to get involved in any of that. This really doesn't concern the French. And so Shelburne pried the new United States away from France and got the Continental Congress to agree to negotiate a separate treaty without France. Now, this was to the benefit of both Britain and the US. It meant that Britain could end hostilities quicker with the United States. It meant that the United States would get a better settlement. The only person that got shafted was France. France got a weaker settlement because they got muscled out of their alliance with the United States. Shelburne was actually very visionary in what he wanted to do with this treaty. Shelburne had a clear idea of where he wanted to go. He's envisioning that this new country, the United States, that Britain will have very close economic ties with it. And Shelburne believed that a prosperous America would lead to a prosperous Britain. And so he was very generous with territorial concessions and enlarged the boundaries of the 13 states considerably. Let's look at this. This is the 13 original colonies. See that dark green? This is what the colonies were fighting for independence. But see all this here, all these other states, this light green, this was everything Shelburne threw in. This was how much Shelburne gave to the United States. When I said he was very generous with Britain's territorial concessions, he basically gave all this stuff to America. Why did Britain cede all this land, right? The colonies are here. I mean, in theory, Britain could have said, all right, you colonies are independent, but we're keeping everything on the other side of the Appalachians. Why do you think Britain was so generous here? What was the benefit of giving all this land to the United States? Anybody want to take a guess? All right, Amanda's going to take a crack at it.
Well, my son Thomas is going to take a crack at it. Here he goes.
All right, Thomas.
So that the original 13 colonies would stop fighting.
So that they would stop fighting? Well, no, they've already agreed to stop fighting. We've already agreed that we're going to stop fighting and recognize their independence. The question is, what are the boundaries going to be? Why would they want America to be so big? That's the question.
It's like a gift to America to like, you're like, hey, sorry about all that. Here's all this land.
And here, make more products so you can send it back to us and we can make more money.
A consolation prize. It does have to do with money. Vicky, go ahead.
So they would be big enough so the other countries couldn't come back and take the land and wealth from the colonies.
Good theory. Basically, the idea that, like, look, we were enemies with you, but at least you're all English speakers. We have a lot in common. If we give it to you, at least those filthy British or Spanish or filthy French and Spanish won't get it, right? Well, it actually has to do with money. This was a very calculated move on the part of Shelburne to grow the United States through the availability of plentiful, cheap land. See, Shelburne knew that if Britain gave all this to the United States, he knew that settlers would go out there and settle the land. They would farm it, and that they would start trading. Now, the settlement of these lands would create a lucrative market for British merchants. But here's the beautiful part. Since it would be American territory, there would be no military or administrative cost to Great Britain. Britain would thus be enabled to reap the financial benefits of trading in this land and with the merchants of this land without having to spend a single penny defending it or governing it. So it's basically saying that he's like planting a market for British goods. He's saying, hey, if we give them all this land, they're going to settle it. They're going to trade throughout it. Our merchants can get in here. We'll make a ton of money trading with all these people, and we don't have to spend 1 cent governing this place. So it was all about the money in the end. And I think it was a brilliant plan on Shelburne's part, because that's exactly what happened. This opened up vast markets for fur trading, for the trading of crops, for all sorts of stuff. And even later, once the industrial age starts and the British could reap the benefits of it. Remember, the British still own Canada, so there's going to be trade between Canada and the US, and they're not going to have to pay to defend it or administer it. Brilliant, Shelburne. Oh, fun fact, the American delegation also wanted Shelburne to give them Canada, but Shelburne said, no, it's a bit too far, chaps. Not giving you Canada. Canada was not in play in the war, but the American delegation tried. They tried to go big. All right. The Commons revolted against Shelburne, though. It aroused the anger of political opponents in Parliament, especially Charles Fox and Lord North. They basically said this was too generous. Look, we're in favor of independence, favor of ending the war, but this is too generous. They didn't have the long view in mind here that Shelburne did. So in mid-1783, they orchestrated a political coalition to force Shelburne out of office, and Shelburne got the heave-ho, which means that Britain had now lost 3 prime ministers in 12 months. Lord North and Fox got a new prime minister, but basically Fox and Lord North were the true powers behind the government at this point. So a lot of political turmoil over this war, right? 3 prime ministers in 12 months, that's a lot. Now, George III, at this point, he was so devastated and broken that he considered abdicating. He was devastated by the loss of the colonies and his own political reverses. It took a severe toll on his mental health. And he actually wrote an abdication letter. This is his abdication letter here. He wrote a speech that he was going to give to Parliament, lamenting the political associations that from the 1760s on continuously frustrated him, frustrated his royal will. He writes in this letter that he's going to just give up the kingship, go back to Hanover in northern Germany, where his family came from. That's wild. By the fall of 1783, though, he had changed his mind, and he would remain on the throne into the second decade of the 1800s. There's a movie, The Madness of King George, which is about King George's mental health in the wake of the Revolutionary War that goes through this. It's a very good movie. I think Nigel Hawthorne plays King George, who's a fantastic actor. So it's amazing thinking this almost reached up to the throne itself. George III actually wrote an abdication speech and considered stepping down over this. So we get the Treaty of Paris. The negotiations with the US were wrapped up quickly by November, but this treaty couldn't be signed until Britain made its separate peace with France, which took a little while. But it was finally signed on September 3rd, 1783. Of the many articles of the treaty, the only article of this treaty that is still in force today is Article 1, whereby Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America, still in force today. So on December of that year, King George had to give a speech to the House of Lords in Parliament. Within that address, George had to mention the recently agreed upon peace treaty. There was representatives of the French monarchy there. And the French diplomat observing George's speech wrote that in pronouncing independence, the King of England did it in a constrained voice. That is, he was compelled to discuss independence in this speech, but it was still personally hurtful to the king. Like he had a hard time when he had to talk about it, he choked up. This was very hard for the king to deal with. In summer of 1785, John Adams, our future president, was presented to George III as the first diplomat representing the United States to Great Britain, our first ambassador to Great Britain. And the purpose of John Adams' meeting with George was to establish friendship between the two nations. And John Adams wrote a very detailed account of this meeting with George III. John Adams came into George III's presence in the audience hall and said, "Sir, the United States of America have appointed me their minister plenipotentiary to your majesty. It is in obedience to their express commands that I have the honor to assure your majesty of their unanimous disposition and desire to cultivate the most friendly and liberal intercourse between your majesty's subjects and their citizens. The appointment of a minister from the United States to your majesty's court will form an epoch in the history of England and of America. I think myself most fortunate than all my fellow citizens in having the distinguished honor to be the first to stand in your majesty's royal presence in a diplomatic character." Very nice speech from Adams. And we have a record of George III's response. Think of all that's happened, all we've seen. Now George III is standing here seeing an ambassador from the United States of America. And how does George III react to him? George III says, "I wish you, sir, to believe that it may be understood in America that I have done nothing in the late contest but what I thought myself indispensably bound to do by the duty which I owed to my people. I will be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said, as I say now, that I will be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. Let the circumstances of language, religion, and blood have their natural and full effect." Very moving. He's basically saying a couple things. In this war, I did what I thought I had to do to preserve my kingdom. And then he says, to be very frank with you, I was the last one who wanted this. But given that independence has happened, it's inevitable, I will be the first one to welcome you with a hand of friendship. And we share so much in common, our language, religion, and our blood. Let's get on with it and be allies. Very magnanimous, very magnanimous. Can you imagine an American politician behaving this way, like somebody from the rival party? Like, I was very much opposed to you, but now that you won, I say, let's be friends and get on with it. Oh, gosh. George III had a lot more character. Hardly the tyrant that he's made out to be, but whatever. Okay, so let's wrap this up with our synopsis. We have a few more slides and then we're done here. So let's just review. From the very beginning, there were many in Britain who were sympathetic to the grievances of the colonies. Right from the beginning, the colonies had sympathy. The British public was never so united behind the war effort as during 1775, 1776, during those first outbreaks of violence, when they were shocked that the Americans were resorting to shooting. The moment they were most united, but even then it was not unanimous. There was some who did not want the war. As time went on, support for the war split upon class lines, the elites favoring the war, the merchants opposing it on economic grounds, and the commoners downright supporting the political ideas of the rebels. After 1777 in the Battle of Saratoga, there was a groundswell of opposition for the war, even within Parliament. The king and his party continued to support it while the Whigs opposed it. After 1780, support for the war dwindled down to just the king and his supporters. There were public protests against every aspect of the war. There were riots against the Papist Act, and a consensus that all sensible men could see that this war was ruinous. It took the military defeat of Yorktown and the fall of Lord North before George III would finally abandon his campaign to subdue the colonies. Immediately after the cessation of the war, the most thoughtful British politicians began to see America as an economic opportunity for the British economy. Now, a little post-credit scene here. After the war was over, politicians in Britain began debating many of the ideas of the American Revolution in Britain, especially related to representation and the monarch's accountability to the people. After decades of wrangling, the British Parliament finally passed a Reform Act of 1832, which was the most sweeping reform of the British government in centuries, and it reformed the British political system along more democratic lines similar to what we have today. So this war led to reform in Great Britain's own political system. It also affected the way Britain handled its other colonies, because remember, Britain had colonies all over the world, like Canada, Australia. So Britain's manner of dealing with its colonies also changed. Instead of treating the colonies like second-class subjects, the British colonies from here on were provided with paths to autonomy through what is called the Commonwealth system, what we have today. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and many of the other smaller colonies attained independence through the political process without the need for violent revolution. And the British founders of the Commonwealth system likely had the experience with America in mind when they created this model. So you can see all these countries that belong to the British Commonwealth today, they didn't need violent revolutions because the British created a path to autonomy that kept them united economically and culturally under the British Empire without necessitating violence. Okay, finally, we have to use what we know here to evaluate our own founding narratives. From the British perspective, the Revolutionary War bears certain similarities to our experience in Vietnam. And what I mean by that is it was a divisive conflict with significant opposition from at home, public protests. There was unclear military objectives. Like, what were the military objectives from the British in the Revolutionary War? What were they trying to do militarily other than put down the revolt? Like, what cities did they need to capture before they won? How many battles did they need to win? What were the military objectives? It was very unclear. There was this gnawing sense that the war was unwinnable, much like the American experience in Vietnam. It's commonly asserted that the USA could have won Vietnam if we'd tried harder. That is, if we were serious about winning it. You will often see one of the narratives about Vietnam, and I'm not saying it's true or false, but just that it's a narrative, is that we did not persevere in Vietnam because we didn't commit wholeheartedly. If we'd really tried, we could have won. Could Britain have contained the revolution? Could Britain had won if it had unified national support, if it had clear military objectives? In other words, we should question this. Did America win the Revolutionary War because we actually beat the British? Or did we win because the British were only ever in it half-hearted to begin with? If the British had marshaled the full force of the global British Empire and said, come what may, even if we have to reduce the colonies to fire and ruin, we are going to put down this rebellion, would we have won? Or did we only win because the British weren't really in it after 1777? And given that by 1781, the British wanted out of the war and saw it as more beneficial to give the colonies independence, did either side really lose? Think about Lord Shelburne's plan. He said, hey, this is a great opportunity. This isn't a loss for Britain. This is an opportunity to make a ton of money in trade with an ideal trading partner here. Given that that's what Britain wanted by that point, did either side really even lose, since we both got in the end what we had wanted eventually? Good questions. That is it, though. That's the end of my presentation. Oh gosh, I went for an hour and a half, even though there was no discussion. I said we go an hour and a half if there was discussion. I just went an hour and a half because I can blab about this stuff forever. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. A little pitch. Most of you came to this presentation through Homeschool Connections. Some of you didn't. Some of you are friends from outside Homeschool Connections. But if you enjoyed this presentation, you will have a chance to download it, to view it again. There'll be a recording you can watch. But more importantly, supporting a presentation like this makes it more likely that I will do more of this in the future. Okay, so if you liked this, please tell your other friends or your homeschooling friends, whoever, just say, hey, I went to this thing last night. It was fantastic. I recommend going to this in the future. I would obviously love to grow these presentations and have more participants. It is my livelihood. I am a history teacher and author by trade, and I do this for a living. So Thank you. And you will get an email probably tomorrow or the day after explaining how to access the recording. If you have any questions on the content, you can always email me, contact me on Facebook. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good night.